I just want to talk a little bit about the Manongs. I actually gained consciousness of the Manongs when I was an undergrad at Loyola Marymount University, which is a Jesuit university in Los Angeles that really stresses service and philanthropy. So an organization went out, this was back in the early 90s, sponsored a trip to Agbayani Village. And this was my freshman and sophomore year, and we would go quarterly just to visit and hang out with the Manongs and talk to them. And it really affected me, those visits. And actually, the first poem that I ever published is about the Manongs. And that poem is actually included in my first book, Imago. So I'm going to read that, and I'm going to read a couple more new poems, actually. Visiting the Manongs in a convalescent home in Delano. Those mountains, ochre in the distance, resembled the wrinkled skins of the Manongs from Delano, a town north of Bakersfield that smells like the first rain after a drought, the pungent collision of earth dryness and sky wetness. The fields near the highways are packed with rows upon rows of sweet melons and sprouts. Filipino migrant workers pick them for cents. Winter peas, oranges, bushels of apples. Their backs arch like bent bamboos. Santa Maria, Barstow, Salinas, Fresno, Seattle, Juneau. The West is too familiar to these lonely old men trapped in their rooms, filled with photographs of white girls they had loved but cannot marry. Each told the story of the collective, the many eyes of a single pineapple. I came to America at 16, at 14, at 12, aboard a dysenteried ship. Looking at the east, shunned by the west, they wander as ghosts in between worlds, haunting and yet haunted by their own ghosts. The white membranes over their eyes like sadness. This is all we know, said the Manongs. To harvest grapes, you must destroy the vines. One thing you need to know about this one, Crowtown, it's actually Delano. It's known as Crowtown because supposedly there's just a lot of crows there. Ode to Table Grapes, Sultana. And Sultana is the green grapes. Ode to Table Grapes, Sultana. Not for wine, juice, nor raisins, slight hug, give from the vine, plucked directly by my mouth. Sultana, your lower sugar content makes you more flavorful. How's that for wisdom? Another nod for moderation against fermentation. Embraced by tulle fog, sweetened by sweat, translucent meat wrapped in slick skin. If I am a crow from Crowtown, I'd steal away clusters of gelatinous green eggs turned orbital balloons. Sunlight concentrate. If I'm Spanish on New Year's midnight, I'd devour 12 for luck, each strike of cathedral bell. And as I am Filipino, lured by Capiz sheen, your duality in oval, my globular fructose, I'm robustly intoxicated. I eat your Veracruz, your Itliong, your revolution. Manong's Lament. We did not intend to stay and live in human-sized chicken coops in the great Central Valley. We followed every promising season with the fervor of migrating across the Pacific onto a flatness landlocked by hills, mountain ranges. Fertile or arid, depending which side we meandered under rain shadows. Under corrugated iron, scorched wood, walls insulated by burlap, makeshift labor camps dismantled as we trailed the feminine fragrance of fields, reminding us of our melon-scented mothers, the apricots of our sisters, the ripening peach harvest of our betrothed, dreamily humming lullabies in a distant archipelago. We stoop to seeded earth, bending half ourselves down, our mule-hard bodies believed to be built for this labor, lowered to soil, worms, and moles. Crouch, looking up the sun-drenched man, tall against the glaring horizon, like the Spaniards on their horses, bestial, bedeviled. We were made accustomed to work for ghosts. Still, we circled the dry summers and damp winters along the stretch of the valley. We pulled at roots and began to forget. We tilled the land and became the land. But our impregnable bodies awoke into daring, collective anger that could no longer bore the burden of our spines. Straightened up, erupted from our thickened citrus-skinned souls to our blood-cracked lips, chanting our desire to return this damned aqueduct region into snowmelt of inland sea. For ourselves, we ask for the minimum in wages and lot, to be surrounded by water again. Thank you very much. It's such an honor to be here.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Christine Bacareza Balance. I come from UC Irvine. I migrated like the Manongs, all the way here tonight. But actually, to be honest, I'm really honored to be here this evening because I actually have followed this film. As I was telling Marissa, I tried to watch in San Francisco. It was sold out. In LA, it was sold out. I just moved back to New York a couple weeks ago, and then I got a Facebook invite saying they were playing at UC Irvine, and I was not there. So finally, I've made it. And I think that kind of, again, tells a lot in terms of what we're about to see in this film, which is stories of migration and movement and stories of persistence, right? So first, I'd like to have a couple of housekeeping notes. The film tonight will be followed by a Q&A, so please stick around. It'll be myself, Marissa Aroy, who is here, as well as we'll be joined, thanks to Google Hangouts, by Professor Don Bohulano Mabalon, who is the author of Little Manila, who will give us a lot of the historical context for this film. So stick around for that. During the film, please turn off all cell phones. Please no texting or paging or paging. What did I even say that? Sorry, it's not even Throwback Thursday. Old. And finally, just a thanks to our sponsors, the Filipino American National History Society Fonds, the Damayan Migrant Workers Association, and finally, the Filipino American Museum. And we'll have a couple words actually from FAM's Theresa Navarro at this moment.
Sure. Hi, I'm Theresa Navarro. I'm here as one of the many dedicated and volunteer staff folks from FAM. FAM stands for the Filipino American Museum, also because we are all FAM. We're all probably all related to somebody in this room, whether we know it or not. It is a platform for Philam art and culture and community, and we seek to participate, facilitate, and just promote new ways of looking at old ideas. So we're particularly honored to be here to co-sponsor this event tonight with Marissa. I had the honor of writing an article and listing this film and Marissa as part of a Latin American culture blog. So it was really exciting to kind of introduce that into a larger discussion beyond the Filipino American community and alongside the Latino American community as well. We'd really like to thank FONS and of course the MEDA and the APA Institute for including us, and to Marissa, Christine, and Don for continuing to, create these conversations and allow these types of pieces of work to be contextualized in a larger way. Thank you again, and we really hope you enjoy the program.
I'm going to ask you a couple of questions. First of all, you left me in a messed up part because I'm like, my makeup's kind of falling. A little bit.
Good.
But
I would
so-
like to squeeze the tears
I know.
out if I can.
So speaking of squeezing out the tears and the story, I just was wondering, because I know this isn't the first documentary you made about Little Manila and that period. I was wondering if you could talk about maybe that that piece itself, and then kind of how from that the story for this film came about.
Sure, sure. First of all, I just want to recognize a couple of people in the audience, a couple of people who worked on this. One is Lisa Whitmer, who worked on Little Manila, and Delano Manongs, who was the co-producer, and she's here tonight and lives in New York now, too. So thank you so much, Lisa. And of course, my husband, who's the producer, who Niall, who I mean, it took us 4 or 5 years to make this, and he was really the one who helped push it over the line, because you kind of lose your motivation to kind of to finish a project after a while. So it was because of him championing it with a lot of the funders that we were able to make it. So making Little Manila was really because of Center for Asian American Media and KVIE, which is this PBS station in Sacramento, California. And they're really good about trying to tell stories of the community, and they wanted to do something about Little Manila because the Filipino community there in Stockton is really strong and had been kind of interested in seeing something done about them. So they're the ones who approached me to produce a film for their series called Viewfinder, and that's when I met Dawn Mabalon for the first time, since she has a foundation called Little Manila Foundation that they run, and they're trying to preserve the history of the Manongs there in Stockton, where they were predominantly the asparagus workers there. And Larry Itliong has a history in Stockton, and so we tell a little bit about the story of Larry Itliong in that Little Manila program. And of course, I grew up in Bakersfield, California, which is only 30 minutes away, and went on the weekends to Delano, where my great aunt and uncle live. So I'm surrounded by the Manongs. But of course, I don't know if any of you feel this way too, but it's sort of like when you're a part of this history, you're part of this story, you don't really appreciate it or value the people. Like I didn't really value the Manongs. They were just around me. They'd give me money on Christmas and my birthdays, and I'd say thank you, Uncle, but I didn't really know their real names or anything. I would just call them Uncle. Like you do. And so it wasn't really just until becoming a filmmaker that I started to appreciate this history.
So I guess, Marissa, but to be more clear in terms of Delano Manongs, what about it kind of jumped out at you in terms of a story? I know. Oh, now there. Hi, Manang. Can we hear you?
Can you hear us, Dawn?
Can you? Okay. Hi. So I'll give you the introduction, Manang. Everyone, this is Dawn Mabalon. She's a professor of history and Asian American studies at San Francisco State. As was mentioned, she's also president of the Little Manila Foundation. She is a Stockton native. That's everyone saying hi. But most importantly, she's also the author of this really amazing, super important book called Little Manila Is in the Heart. So I think in terms of what you can get in a 60-minute documentary, or even, in the Fall of the Eye Hotel, kind of 90-minute, 100-minute documentary, you can get way more in-depth, right, in a book that at one point was like almost 500 pages, right?
650.
Ah, okay. But the publisher said, cut it down. It's too long. Nobody's going to buy it.
Filipino through Stockton, but not that much.
Yeah, not that much. Put it on the web. So yes, and these are on sale outside, so that's the little commercial break. But I guess, Marissa, in terms of, sorry, just to finish that question, in terms of pulling out the story of Delano itself and the Manongs, and of Larry Itliong as this figure, right? Because I think, I know for myself as an undergrad, Philip Veracruz is the name that was very much put out there, right? And we knew there was some kind of like rift between the Filipinos and the Mexicans, but Larry Itliong was kind of this secondary figure is kind of what we start to see in the film also. So I wondered how, and maybe in your research, how he came forth as a story that you wanted to tell.
Oh, when we were doing research for Little Manila, we would find these wonderful photographs of Larry Itliong, and he was just such a striking figure, and we sort of had a crush on him, you know? Like what?
He's kind of like a rock star in this.
He's a rock star. I needed like some kind of tough idols, Filipino tough idols out there. And so I was just really interested in finding out more about him. And it really, we were able to get a lot of these archival transcripts or archival interviews of Larry Itliong through the community. So there's 3 interviews actually of him that you hear, and 2 of them, they were found from people in the community. One is from Debbie Louie, who is from Stockton, California. Larry Itliong came to her class in Santa Cruz, at UC Santa Cruz, and they basically recorded that class time. So that was one. And then the second one was from Mignon Gelly, who had a cassette tape of interviewing Larry Itliong when she was 16 years old and went down to Delano and asked him some really basic questions about, why are you doing this? What is the UFW? So, but it was really, those are really important questions. She's a little embarrassed by like, oh, they're such silly basic questions, but they were, you know, it was really great to have that on tape and to hear his voice talk about it and explain it. And so we use a lot of that. And then the third our audio interview is from Jacques Levy, who is the biographer of Cesar Chavez. And it happened that he had an interview at Yale University. And I don't think anyone knew about that interview. So I actually put on Facebook, can anyone go to Yale for me? This is when we were living in California. And it was through the Facebook community that we finally were able to find somebody to go to Yale and get the interview. And put it in the documentary. Yeah.
So Manong, it was kind of, the first question I asked Marissa was around kind of origins in terms of what drew her to the project, and I wondered for yourself if you want to answer that question, but also too in terms of situating yourself in terms of this Manong history, which I know you can do. So.
Yeah, you know, I'm glad I
Hi.
This is Phil. Hi. You know, I have a very similar story. All of these Manongs around me, you know, down the street, in my family, this incredible history, you know, but you don't, and I say this in the introduction of my book, for us it was memory, because it wasn't something that we learned in school. You know, these are memories, these are the old people in our family, and yeah, they give us candy, they give us money, you know, they sit around and drink and tell stories, and that's about it, you know, and these are our, you know, a lot of them, and they never married, you know, and then I went to UCLA, and kind of a little bit before that, my uncle Fred Cordova, who's a cousin of my father, had written Filipinos, Forgotten Asian Americans. You know, and that was important for me in high school, but again, it wasn't something that we learned in school. So it was just kind of like, oh, look at this fun little community book. You know, it's important, but, you know, and then I went to UCLA.
So Manong, you just cut out. Can you go back to the UCLA part? Rewind.
20 years ago, you know, I'm sitting in Filipino American history class, and people who were in my class were people from like Cerritos or New Jersey or, you know, different places of like kind of post-1965 centers of Filipino, you know, the Filipino populace, and they're like, wow, you're a Filipino from Stockton. You're like the real thing. You know, wow. You knew the Manongs. It's such and such, you know, and you know, it was really like understanding. You have to leave home to kind of understand home and put it into context and realize that these are my family memories, but it's also American history. And so it kind of launched me into this 20-year odyssey that eventually became this 450-page book. Not just Filipinos in Stockton, but I like to think of it as the story of kind of Filipinos trying to find a home for themselves on the West Coast in the 20th century. So, and Larry Itliong is a player in the book too. Am I gone from the screen? Yes.
But we can hear your voice, so it's like listening to NPR. Like we're all on the same car together. Projection, can we? Okay, I think we're still, maybe, can I ask a question to Marissa? So we can embody you again. So Marissa, I was wondering in terms of, well, okay, so the kind of question I was also interested in terms of maybe the difficulties in making this film, because I think Theresa had mentioned in her intro, you know, there's a lot of this history where we want to kind of talk about or glorify kind of the connections that happen between Chicanos and Filipinos, right? Like that it is this moment that enables a type of collaboration, right, or working across. And then, but then there's also the possibility of somebody kind of has to come to the forefront. So I wondered in the making of the film if you encountered any difficulties from, I guess, the Chicano side. I mean, you do see Dolores Huerta, you do see Cesar Chavez's son, but if there were any other kind of pressures you came up against?
Not during the making of it. In fact, the UFW, the Cesar Chavez Foundation, Dolores Huerta, Richard Chavez, they were all very encouraging about the history of the Manongs, and they actually have a lot of love for the Filipinos. And even when there were difficulties with Larry, that they had with Larry, with Philip Veracruz, and others, they still encapsulated the memories of the Manongs with a lot of warmth and affection and loyalty. Mm-hmm. But I was still very nervous about screening the film for them in Agbayani Village, which just happened in July. They had an event commemorating the Manongs, and I'd like to think it was because it was just an event for Agbayani Village to commemorate. It was an anniversary for Agbayani Village. But I also think they were getting a lot of flack because of the Chavez film and sort of the lack of real representation of the Filipino side in the film. And so the director of the UFW was there, Paul Chavez, a number of people from the Chavez family was there, Dolores was there, and her children. And so that was probably the most nerve-wracking screening to have, because I wasn't sure about their reactions to Larry and Alex Fabros's thoughts about how the Manongs felt and how Larry felt in the end. But it was, they were fine with it. They clapped. They were there. We had a Q&A afterwards, and then Paul Chavez, who was the head of the Chavez Foundation, came up to me and said we should sell Delano Manongs in the gift store in La Paz, and I guess that was his like seal of approval of it. Yeah. So that all went fine. Mm-hmm. Now Dolores has a different take. Dolores Huerta has a different take on some things in the history, but she's able to communicate that, like where she feels that that she should be represented better. One place is that she says that Agbayani Village was her idea. So I'm not going to dispute her with that, but according to the papers and the memos from Larry Itliong that I found at Wayne State University, mm-hmm. he was really pushing to have some type of retirement home for the Manongs. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So we'll just leave it at that.
So another question that I think also comes up for me in watching this film, and I think when you're talking about hagiography or the history of this time, is, as always, the kind of the prevalence of the male narrative, right? Or these men and kind of the ways in which they weren't, the anti-miscegenation laws that were held against them, but the ways in which, too, that they were still able to be family. So I wondered, in your book, though, you do have a chapter where you talk about gender and the fact that there were Manongs, right? That there were women. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that and the way it plays out in your book.
Okay, your last part of your question cut out, but I think I know where you're going.
Yeah.
One of the reasons why I wrote the book was because, to really recover this rich history, but also to put a lens on it, a lens about gender and power and sexuality. And one of the things that you'll see is that, you know, this extreme sex ratio imbalance of so few Filipino women and so many Filipino men. Hi, everybody. Is that women, that gender roles transform in the early part of this 20th century, in the first decades of Filipino settlement in the United States. I mean, you have women in the United States who have more power in their sexual lives, in their lives as wives, as mothers, than they've ever had before in their lives. I mean, divorce is still illegal in the Philippines. It's not illegal in the United States. I mean, I found that married several times. You know, imagine being a young woman who had your pick. If you were in an abusive relationship, you could leave. You know, and you don't see that situation happen, especially after World War II, when the sex ratio imbalance evens out and more women come after World War II. So I really wanted to look at that and that sense of power that women had, where they felt, look, if I was in a bad relationship, I could go, because there were 5 other men knocking on my door and I could kick anybody else I wanted. You know, imagine that. I mean, when I wrote that chapter, I was fully single in graduate school, and it was this fantasy of mine to go back in time and be a Manong in the 1940s. You know, like,
And then make it a reality show.
how about you?
All right, Manong, I think we're going to move it to questions from the audience.
When are you going to have this, the film ready and for public consumption? Because I understand it's only available for institutions.
Right. Oh, it's going to broadcast in May on PBS as part of a package. It's for May. May is Asian Pacific Asian Pacific Islander Heritage Month.
American Heritage Month.
Yes. Yeah.
API.
And it's going to be packaged actually with 2 other films, Harana, which is sort of like the Buena Vista Social Club of the Philippines film, and with Jeepney, which was also just recently made and is kind of touring around in festivals right now.
Question in the back?
Were there several waves of Filipino farmers who came? Or, because that's what I remember, that they were recruiting Filipinos in the Philippines, mainly in the Ilocos region, to come, you know, free, to just come and work the farms. But was the Delano group the first group, one of the middle groups? Do you know?
Donna, did you hear the question?
Let me take that. The first Filipinos who come in large numbers that come via labor recruitment are actually the Visayan families who come in the first decade of the 20th century, who are recruited by the Hawaiian Sugar Planters Association, and they send recruits. By the 19-teens and 1920s, the HSPA shifts and they begin to recruit in Ilocos, and mostly among single men. Their argument is that, well, single men, they're cheaper, you know, they won't bring families over, we don't have to feed the children, we could give them labor contracts and then send them back. And this creates an excitement in the provinces, and I talk about this in my book, you know, this excitement of these Hawaiianos who come back and they bring back photo albums and photographs and records and all this technology and suits, you know, and then everybody, and this is all going on in tandem with the American colonial educational system, in which they're told America is the greatest country on earth. These Hawaiianos are sending money back, and there's this excitement. I mean, there's one story I talk about in the book that Filipinos were so hungry to go to Hawaii because of the economic dislocations in their provinces as a result. Vote to go to Hawaii, right? And that was like 500 Filipinos who wanted to do that. By the 1920s, Filipinos started going straight to the mainland. So 1924, Filipinos in Hawaii start to organize, and there's a massive strike in Hawaii in 1924. A lot of the plantation owners blacklist these Filipinos who are these very radical labor leaders. I don't know, anybody a Giants fan out there? Okay. Well, Tim Lincecum's great-grandparents were labor organizers in the sugar plantations of Hawaii, Giants pitcher. And so they had to leave, and that's why they came to Stockton, for example. By the 1920s...
I like the way you slipped that in there, Mono.
So, world champion, science team, anyway. I even mentioned him in my introduction. You guys got to buy the book to see it. For a number of reasons. They want to go to college, and they end up going to work in the fields to support themselves because they're not government-sponsored students like the several hundred that came at the turn of the century. And so these thousands of mostly male migrants end up being the generation that begin the Delano Grape Strike in the 1960s. These are the single men that come over, you know, most of them lower middle class, a few years of education, hoping to finish high school, hoping to go to college, end up in agricultural labor, find no other kind of economic mobility, become some of the most militant labor organizers in the United States, and then form the UFW. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you.
Other questions or comments? We actually had a question in terms of, before seeing this film, if you had kind of seen other films that were of the same genre. I mean, again, I'm particularly thinking of The Fall of the I Hotel, you know what I mean? And in terms of, I mean, I think it operates very differently, but if that in any way kind of colored your relationship to, again, the story you're going to tell, what you're going to talk about.
Yes, I had seen Fall of the I Hotel, and then there was one that Fonz did quite a few years ago, and I saw that, and I think it was sponsored by AT&T. But at the time, for a while I had been working with a Japanese American filmmaker, and he had made a number of films about Japanese Americans. And he had said to me, you know, you should really think about what kind of stories you want to tell about the Filipino community. And so it was really him who planted that seed of like, what are the stories out there to tell? And it took me a while to figure out like how to value the stories of the Manongs, of my family, and of Filipinos. But it was because of him, and watching a lot of his films about Japanese Americans and the history of Japanese Americans in here, particularly about the settlements, World War II, and the dropping of the bombs on Japan, and that kind of started the journey of thinking about what kind of stories to tell about the Filipino Americans.
I think there's.
Hi, Marissa. First of all, I want to thank you for creating this film. And Dawn, I wanted to say hello. This is Joel.
It's Joelman.
It's Joelman.
I'm sorry.
Hey, Dawn.
Oh my God,
You are the real deal. I wanted to ask you both a question about where do you want to see this film as far as its impact on the Filipino community and maybe even society at large? I mean, there's a way, you know, I get concerned that this can become just like a history book that's placed on the shelves. But I know Dawn very well, and I know that there's a way we want the story to sort of connect to, as an educator, to connect to our students in the communities that we work with. How can it transcend then like boundaries around generation and even distance when we're out here in New York and this is a story that took place in California generations ago? So could you speak a bit about like what would you like to see as far as its place in our communities and in society? Thank you.
I feel like I'm starting to see it. Just now in October, there were 10 screenings, mostly in California, all in California actually, for Filipino American History Month. And we've seen a number of the universities all over the country purchase the film and that's been my biggest goal, is to make sure that it gets into classrooms in universities and in high schools and in middle schools if possible. I think it's starting to happen. The PBS broadcast is really important in order to get to kind of the larger audience of Americans out there. But my goal is that there's somebody who is like me, Filipino American growing up in California, who I had no history of the Filipinos, and I grew up in Bakersfield. You know, that was like, I mean, the grape strike was all around us. But that they get something of this history by this being used in a classroom along with a lesson plan. And if it's just one day of this, then I'll be very happy. And I hope what it does is really just spark their interest in learning more about this. So this is just the beginning, the first step of learning about their history. And I hope it makes them hungry to learn more and to read Don's book and read Philip Veracruz and read Filipinos, the forgotten Americans or forgotten Asians. Like all of it, just to learn to explore their history.
Fantastic, and I totally agree with everything that Marissa said. I think it was so wonderful to see Delano Manongs go all over the state. You know, we've been talking in Filipino American studies and in our community about how powerful the story is and how it needs to be learned by everyone. And so that's one of the reasons why this film is such a gift. You know, so thank you, Marissa, for making something that is so powerful and can touch so many people. I mean, I know with my book, it's kind of big. It's like 450 pages, you know. Not everybody's going to read every single word, and not everybody has time. You brought up the Follow the Eye Hotel. When I saw the Follow the Eye Hotel, it's one of the reasons why I wrote this book. You know, it made me go back to Stockton and say, what do you mean they tore down Little Manila there too? You know, this film is going to inspire so many thousands of people to ask more questions of their families, of themselves, of their communities, of American history, you know, and so I really see this amazing future. I mean, in California, we have our first Filipino assembly member, Rob Monta, and one of his first bills was to teach Filipino American labor history in K through 12 schools. And so it's beginning. You know, we're writing the curriculum, and it's a matter of now taking it national. You know, and this film, the power of this film is going to be incredible in the next few years and with this next generation. I mean, I can't wait to show it to my nieces and nephews who are 10 years old and say, hey, you know, Larry Itleo was your grandpa's friend. You know, and he lived down the street. Uncles in our community. So yeah, it gives me goosebumps to think about the impact of this film and this story, not just on the Filipino American, Asian American community, but everybody who wants to learn about social justice and labor justice in the United States.
And I just also as an educator, and also to answer Jolman's question a little bit, and also to give, you know, a shout out to the Mayan, is to understand, you know, that there is a type of Filipino migrant labor history that still continues to this day, right? So I think about the work of Kathy Choi and looking at the longer history of Filipino nurses, right? So again, these kind of everyday laborers that we take for granted, right? The Filipino nanny, like they're these figures that we might make jokes about, or, you know what I mean, see on television, but there is a history, and there's a reason why they're here, right? Which I think is also what's important about Dawn's book, is she's not just talking about, oh, things sucked in the Philippines, so they came to the US, more opportunity, right? Like that easy narrative, like there's a lot of push-pull, a lot of that propaganda stuff, right? That needs to be told, and that Filipinos still are, you know, the migrant labor of the world, right? So, yeah. Okay, one last question, comment. Yes.
Sorry. Hi. I wanted to say I love history, and seeing this was an eye-opener for me because I never knew a lot of the information that was brought into this. But I guess a question that came to my mind from the documentary was that when the Filipino migrant workers as well as the Chicanos joined together and it said that they did a united front to create a union. In your opinion, do you believe that because I forgot the word in psychology, but there's an associative term where we tend to, because we process so much information or stimuli in a day, that we try to see where things are similar? And because the Filipinos and the Hispanics at the time might have been similar to, let's say, the owner, I guess you could say the slave owners of the owners of those fields, and because the Filipinos also had names like Philip Veracruz and names that were very Hispanic in origin, do you think that the reason why the Filipinos got in a sense the short end of the stick was because to the rest of America they were, Hispanics just like the Hispanics? So when they did grant the union, they were thinking that they were doing it for all the Hispanics when they were actually doing it for Hispanics and Filipinos.
I think there's a part of that. I'm not sure if the growers necessarily would have had a hard time knowing the difference, differentiating between the Filipinos and the Mexicans, because the growers had actually been working with the Mexicans and Filipinos for a long time and had strategically tried to separate those crews. But I think probably from the outside and to a lot of the press and maybe just middle America, if you look at the farmers or the farm workers at that time, they are just a bunch of brown people, and I don't think you would have a difficult time trying to figure out like who's Filipino and Mexican. I mean, when I was doing the research on this and trying to find faces of Filipinos, I would sit there and go, "Is that a Filipino?" Like, oh, okay, that's the Filipino nose. Okay, that's a Filipino. Yeah.
But I think that the one thing that they did share, which is the historical reality of Spanish colonialism for over 500 years. And again, you look at the galleon trade, right? There are these connections between Mexico and the Philippines that have already been going on even before the U.S. kind of enters, right, the story and before U.S. land. So, Dawn, did you have any last comments or want to answer?
Well, in terms of saying that the Filipinos are kind of matriarchal and the Chicanos are machismo, I think it's a little simplistic to think about that in terms of these two groups. I mean, one of the reasons why there was some friction between the two groups is that Filipinos were not hesitating to use violence.
Yes. Violence. She said violence.
Violence.
Okay. Well, I mean, they had to tell Filipinos, can you please put your guns and knives away? The media is here. Like ABC News is here, Filipino. Can you please put your knife away? I mean, these are old Filipinos who have been fighting the cops and the sheriffs since the 1920s. And when their gas was shut off and their water, and they're getting beaten by police, and then the NFWA and all these civil rights workers who are coming in saying, okay, everybody, we're going to go pray the rosary now. And these Filipinos were like, are you effing kidding me? We're going to pray the rosary right now. Let's just go shake the sheriff right now. Okay.
I think we'll end on the violence and the guns and the badassery. And thanks once again, Marissa.
Thank you, everyone, for being here.